After thinking about it for several weeks, I went to the Appalachian Mountains for a lonely weekend, hoping to get something calm in return for the never-ending roar of urban life. The drive up the narrow mountain road, where occasionally deer darted in the underbrush and gravel crunched under my SUV's tires, had set the stage for what I'd hoped would be a serene retreat. In my early 30s, I was still getting the hang of solo camping, and I loved the outdoors. Once I got to the camp location, I looked around the isolated site, surrounded by thick forests. I took a deep breath, inhaled slowly through my nose, filling my lungs with fresh mountain air, and exhaled slowly through my mouth. I started putting the tent up and soon had all the camping gear lying out. So that was the time I spotted a small, shabby tent near the clearing. Although it had an out-of-place appearance, the tent met the expected standards for cold nights that you might experience out here. Two men approached a dimly visible trail as the sun dipped behind the mountains, casting long shadows and bringing an early chill. Their attire struck me immediately: tight jeans and plain t-shirts, unsuitable for hiking or the cool weather. They introduced themselves with tight smiles and awkward laughter that didn't quite reach their eyes. Despite their friendly attempts, the interaction felt forced. When I engaged them in small talk, their responses were vague. I asked about their hiking experiences, but they dodged my questions with only evasive replies. After they returned to their tent, which seemed far too small for both of them, I felt uneasy about the situation. Their lack of proper gear and odd behavior didn't sit right with me. Later that night, as I tried to relax by my campfire, the rustle of leaves and occasional snaps of twigs nearby kept me on edge. Then, hushed voices near my tent cut through the quiet night. Peeking out, I saw the glow of a flashlight and the silhouettes of the two men standing unsettlingly close, murmuring in tones too low to catch. My heart pounded, and I decided it was time to leave. I quickly packed everything with trembling fingers under the cold glow of the headlamps, stumbling over my gear. I remained as quiet as I possibly could while I hiked back the way I came down the trail, my heavy breathing mixing with a crunch of leaves. When I got to the car, I noticed an old, dust-covered car next to mine. I thought about what happened to the long unvisited owner, drew my conclusions, and then left. I drove home in silence, lost in my thoughts about what might lurk in the woods. Days later, a news report chilled me to the bone. It was about a missing elderly man, and his car was the very one I had seen. The reality of my narrow escape from potential danger sank deep. Reflecting on the events, I realized how deceptive the calm of nature could be. The weekend had started with an anticipation of tranquility, but ended with lingering unease. A reminder of how quickly beauty can turn sinister when shaded by the presence of hidden dangers. The solo camping trip by the riverside was a pretty tranquil retreat, a chance to be one with nature, away from the everyday hassle of life. The place was ideal, set in such a remote location where the only ambient sound was a soft murmur of the river. I really enjoyed this quietness and, to be more precise, the solitude of the place. However, a stranger named John broke this sense of peace when he arrived at my campsite. He said he was camping somewhere nearby and had engaged in some conversation, but he was quite friendly and appeared anxious from his behavior, a subtle sort of offense that set me ill at ease. With the realization that John had come not longer after I'd set up camp, an unsettling suspicion comes to mind. Had he been watching, or worse, following me? The next day, my unease doubled when I found John sitting next to my unlit campfire, as if he had been waiting for me. Suffice it to say, his presence seemed completely invasive, his eyes shining with a strange, almost predatory glint. He urged me, with some eagerness, to follow him to the river to see something, out of the ordinary, as he said. But every instinct in me was crying that there was something wrong. His invitation carried an underlying threat, and I couldn't shake off the feeling of danger. I had turned down John's offer in the politest, yet most affirmative manner. I had an inner feeling that the way he looked at me was kind of carrying out some sort of threat. John's reaction to my rejection confirmed my suspicions. At this point, his friendly facade began to crumble, giving way to an ominous one. I could sense a tension in the air, the once peaceful campsite turning into the backdrop for a frightening standoff. I stood firm, thought it was very intimidating, and noticed John's every move. I was kind of nervous at times when I had suspicions about potential dangers. That was how the meeting with John turned my peaceful solo adventure into something really jangling, a stark reminder of the capriciousness of strangers. He was at my campsite, standing in front of me with an initially very friendly face that subsequently deteriorated to being quite unfriendly. And that's when I noticed something chilling, the outline of a gun under his shirt. I realized I could be stepping into danger. My heart missed a beat. The peaceful-looking campsite seemed like something to use against someone, some kind of standoff with a tranquility very threatened. There was tension in the air as John and I faced off. I tensed, feeling like every muscle in my body was full of readiness. I swallowed my fear and tried to act calmly, realizing that every wrong step could cause more aggression from John. Finally, or so it seemed to my terrified mind, John retreated. He left the campsite, swallowed by the forest darkness. His departure, however, did little to alleviate the anxiety that had gripped me. That left me jumpy for the rest of the trip, always looking over my shoulder and jumping at every sound. The fear of his return had hung over my head like some death sentence, turning what was supposed to be a relaxing trip into a nightmare. Sleep was elusive, and the once soothing sounds of the river now seemed to echo my paranoia. My experience with John altered how I see camping alone at night in my mind. It went from what should have been a wonderful camping trip alone to getting nights where I could sleep and days full of anxiety. The scare and suspicion persisted, making the experience intense. My camping trip began with an isolated trip to the wet, green woods of Washington, the solitude of the forest, and getting close to nature. I looked forward to an isolated weekend away from it all. As I was setting up my tent, I decided that it was high time to take a short walk, so I made a promenade in the woods, which were nearby. And during one of these walks, something odd came to my attention. A couple with a noisy shopping cart, full to the brim with rusty, noisy things. She smiled innocently, saying they knew where the campsite was, and that I wanted to join her friends. I knew her friendly manner wiped out my weariness. Before long, she grabbed my arm gently, and I followed them through the woods, which I didn't find too off-putting at the time. It came off as friendly. The deeper we went, the more it seemed like a creepy hush was beginning to take hold on the paths between the thick forest trunks. The man was silent, but he was looking at me. His eyes seemed quite hungry and animal-like, which was probably the start of me feeling pretty uncomfortable. By this time, she had taken her hand and grasped my arm harder, and her nails dug into my skin, changing what was friendly into something threatening. My apprehension grew with each step toward an old, half-broken-down trailer hidden among the trees. Its presence almost blended in, yet it was starkly gruesome against the natural beauty surrounding it. The woman's grip became vice-like, just as her pleasant demeanor had become something quite sinister. While fear and resolve were reigning over me, I suddenly remembered an emergency whistle in my pocket. After inhaling the air incredibly forcefully, I blew it with all I could. It was as if one sharp sound emerged from the woods and filled the eerie silence with a desperate cry for help from one tree to another. I took advantage of that little surprise, pulling my arm free from the woman's surprisingly strong grip. Adrenaline surged through my veins as I turned and sprinted toward my campsite, my feet barely touching the ground. I heard the couple's shouts in my ears, angry and frustrated. The shouts started to sound lost into the distance. Right away, as I forced my legs to go faster, the cold air biting at my lungs. Branches whipped past my face, some catching on my clothes, but I didn't slow down. Every snap of a twig under my footsteps sounded like a gunshot in the forest silence, keeping me going. As I packed, I was deeply aware of how close I had come to danger. The couple's friendly facade had hidden dark intentions. This realization made me pack faster, and once I had everything, I didn't waste a moment. I lifted my backpack and departed from the campsite, continuously scanning my surroundings to make sure no one was trailing me. With those and a few other thoughts in mind, I made haste back to my car, just in case he came after me. The drive back home was fairly quiet, with reflections on the meeting. My whole mind was busy with many important thoughts, such as if it had not been for that whistle and several others, regarding my escape from the scene and how I always wanted to be ready for any random threats, especially in isolated places. I drove away from the site with cloudy thoughts, realizing that behind those friendly smiles, danger had been lurking. That experience drowned out what should have been a nice, relaxing solo retreat, and it taught me a big lesson on how it pays to be careful. Yes, even in what seems like safe places.